Good morning, everyone. My name is Clive Vinti. I'm together here with my team, with MacKay. We are at XA Global Trade Advisors, and today we want to talk to you about the government policy of designation. And we're just going to walk you through designation as and when it was mooted in 2011 up until the present day, where it now sits within the Public Procurement Act. So, what is designation as a starting point? So designation is essentially a tool of South Africa's industrial policy. So if you take a step back, South Africa, in the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan adopted by the President in 2020, mooted the idea that we need to industrialize partly through what is called localization. And localization simply speaks to the idea of the use of local raw materials and the local production of goods. So the government sees that part of the policy in terms of industrialization, one of the tools we'll use is the idea of localization. Now, localization itself manifests in South Africa through various instruments, but the one we want to focus on today is the instrument of designation. So when you think about designation, you think about localization. Localization is one of the ways the government sees us being able to industrialize, to address the three evils of, unemployment and poverty and inequality. So the key thing that you must keep at the back of your mind about localization is that the DTIC itself has said in 2021 that it wants to target a localization of target of at least reducing the non-import bill by at least 20% by 2026. So there was a 5-year plan to say we want to reduce the imports of non-oil imports by at least 20%. And the idea then was that we should localize that. Now, that idea of localization, like I said, proceeds from the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan of the President, and then, of course, carries over into the idea of what is called designation. Now, designation itself predates the President's Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. So designation itself was mooted in 2011, as I'll show you in a little bit. But the idea behind designation really, as you've already seen on screen, and as I've already said about localization, designation is about localization. What does it mean? It simply means that the government, in its tenders, is allowed to say you are required to ensure that if you apply for a tender, the goods that you're going to produce must have a specific local content in terms of raw materials. And secondly, the goods must be locally produced. So designation itself proceeds out of localization. Localization itself, like I said, is part of government's official policy of ensuring industrialization. So if you think about the three pillars, essentially really of designation, that it sits obviously in government tenders, and it requires use of local raw materials, and of course, it requires local production. So therefore, designation is a form of preferential procurement policy. Now, we know preferential procurement policy arises out of the Constitution. So if you look at Section 217 of the Constitution, it does advocate for a policy of preferential procurement, but of course, that needs to be balanced with other factors like cost effectiveness and efficiency. So how did we get here? As I've already alluded to, the designation predates the President's 2020 Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. So the idea of localization, like I said, which is the mother of designation, is that localization essentially was mooted, at least in the South African context in 2011, in the Local Procurement Accord. So the Local Procurement Accord was signed by essentially the net-like partners, right? Your business, your trade unions and government, and the social partners. And the idea there was that we wanted to have a target, which was quite ambitious, at least then and now, of 75% local content, right? Procurement. So the idea was that for goods and services that would be procured, the idea was that those goods should be procured at a target of 75%. Now, that Local Procurement Accord was then translated into the Preferential Procurement Regulations. Now, the Preferential Procurement Regulations come out of the PPPFA. Now, if you look at the PPPFA itself as legislation, it doesn't actually make any statement in relation to the idea of designation or preferential procurement, right? It does, of course, speak about the idea that there needs to be preferential procurement, but designation itself is not mentioned. The idea of designation appears for the first time in the Preferential Procurement regulations to the PPPFA. So the 2011 Local Procurement Accord is the policy instrument, which is non-binding, where there's a commitment to localize goods and services at a 75% target. That then gets translated into a binding instrument in the regulations to the PPPFA in 2011. And in there, we see for the first time the designation instrument. That designation instrument essentially says the following. It says that the GTIC, in consultation with National Treasury, can designate a sector or a subsector for local production and for the use of local content. It also says that, in fact, government organs themselves can actually also self-designate, meaning they can designate outside of the GTIC process. Right? So there were two ways, and there have always been two ways of designation. It was always supposed to be either the GTIC does the designation in consultation with Treasury, or organs of state could self-designate. That was in the 2011 regulations. Those were repealed and replaced by the 2017 regulations. So the 2017 regulations essentially carried the same provision on designation, that the GTIC in consultation with National Treasury would designate. And secondly, organs of state could also self-designate if they believe that a particular product could be procured locally and using local raw materials to a certain extent. So with designation, as you will note, we have 29 sectors that have been designated for local content and local production, ranging really from 10, 15, 20%, all the way up to 100%, right? So between 2011 and 2017, we see a whole host of designations that have been done. At present, we count up to 29 designated sectors. Some will say it's 28. The problem with the language of sectors is that it includes a whole host of products. By our count, at least 100 products are covered in those different sectors. And that's part of the problem with designation, which we'll paint. But in any event, we know that designation set in the 2017 regulations. That was the last iteration in terms of regulations where we saw designation. What then happened was that Agribusiness, which is now Sakelicha, then took the Minister of Finance to court to contest what was then the pre-qualification criteria that's set within the Preferential Procurement regulations of 2017. Now, they successfully managed to get the Constitutional Court to confirm that, in fact, those pre-qualification criteria that the minister had come up with in the regulations were unconstitutional, because that power essentially sat with the relevant organ that was doing the particular tender. So because the minister didn't have power to come up with the pre-qualification criteria under our constitutional scheme, at least under the scheme of the Preferential Procurement regulations, the Court, our highest court, decided that, in fact, the rest of the regulations were also unconstitutional, because they believed that the pre-qualification criteria essentially contaminated the rest of the regulations in the 2017 Preferential Procurement regulations. So we have designation being minted in legislation in 2011. Those are replaced by the 2017 regulations, which have designation. But when Sakelicha takes the government to court to challenge the pre-qualification criteria, essentially challenging the Minister of Finance's powers to come up with these pre-qualification criteria for tenders, the court says you're correct to Sakelicha. Indeed, the minister does not have this power. He's acting outside of his powers. But not only that, by consequence, incidentally, because these pre-qualification criteria have an impact on the rest of the regulations, the court then says, because you can't read the rest of the regulations without reading the pre-qualification criteria, it contaminates the whole set of regulations. By default, then, designation was deemed unconstitutional as a consequence of that. So essentially, it was the fruit of the poison tree. So this was in 2022. So subsequent to that, Treasury then came up with the new Preferential Procurement regulations. And oddly, when the new regulations came out in 2022, designation was removed. Still not sure why, but at that time, designation seemed to have been removed from our framework. We thought that was the end of it. And then, of course, in 2024, during that period, of course, we then have the Public Procurement Act, which goes through the public consultation process and eventually gets adopted by Parliament and signed into law by the President in 2024. And in there, suddenly in Section 20 of the Procurement Act, the Public Procurement Act, we see designation for the first time minted in an actual act of Parliament. Because remember, in the PPPFA, designation was not mentioned. It was actually mentioned for the first time in the regulations to the PPPFA in 2011 and in 2017. So when designation dies in 2022 before the Constitutional Court, we think that's the end of it. It reappears again in the 2024 Public Procurement Act in Section 20. We'll unpack that. That's really the focus of the day. We'll unpack as to what that looks like and what is the framework that has been adopted there. Of course, recently now we have the Draft General Public Procurement Regulations, which oddly, just like the 2022 regulations, don't actually provide a framework for the designation process. So the designation process currently sits only the Procurement Act. The Draft General Public Procurement Regulations have a huge gap in the sense that they actually do not address the designation process, at least as we envisaged should have happened. So just a brief rundown of the history of designation and what it looked like. Because if you remember, we say designation set in the 2011 regulations. It also set in the 2017 regulations. So historically speaking, designation functioned, right? The idea that you must use local raw materials, that you must locally produce goods, was actually a gatekeeping requirement. Meaning, if you didn't comply with the designation requirement, for example, in terms of wheelie bins, in terms of textiles, in terms of clothing, in terms of footwear for government tenders, you would not go on to the second stage of the evaluation of your bid. So when the bid was evaluated, the first thing that was checked was, did you comply with the designation requirement? If you did not, you would be disqualified. They wouldn't even go to the second stage of evaluation on price and BE score. So as you can see, then that designation was quite powerful in that particular process. Now, out of that particular process from 2011 up until now, we know that 29 sectors have been designated. 60 billion, according to the IPAP, the Industrial Policy Action Plan of 2018-2019, 60 billion has been locked in as a result of designation. However, only 4.4% of those designated tenders have actually been evaluated for compliance with the local content requirement. So you can see quite minuscule how small the amount is in terms of verification that we had, at least at that time. Of course, the amount that 60 billion has been locked in doesn't really give us any idea of what that actually means. It's unclear to us what that actually means when you say 60 billion has been locked in. What does that got to do, for example, with employment? How does that impact employment? How does that impact inequality? How does that impact the idea of poverty? Those three evils that we seek to address, we have no idea. Now, like I said, the verification gap is quite staggering. So at that time in 2018, 2019, going to 2020, the Industrial Policy Action Plan considered that 96% of the value of designated tenders was simply unverified. So we had no idea whether these people actually were complying with local content or not. Now, what is it that we don't know about designation? Because the key theme that runs through the policy of designation as an industrial policy mechanism is that we don't really know. We don't know a lot. We also don't know what we don't know, but we'll come back to this theme. But the overriding theme across the policy of designation is that we really don't know what we don't know. Now, what is that we don't know? This is the easiest part. We don't know who applied to have a sector designated. So with 29 sectors that have been designated, we don't know who is actually the applicant. We don't know why was one sector designated and not another sector designated. We don't know who was consulted. We don't know when this happened. We don't know when the investigation was done, when did it begin, when did it end? Because remember, there is no gazette that would tell you that a sector is actually being investigated for designation. So since 2011 until now, we will not find a single record of government actually telling us we are proposing a designation, there's investigation happening, these are the people that we're going to consult, this is the period that this process will go through. We don't know who the investigators were. We don't know who the decision makers were in that particular investigation. There are no evaluation reports from the DTIC or Treasury to tell us. So to be clear, we have made a request to the DTIC to find out what happened with these 29 sectors that got designated. We've filed prior requests, they've all been rejected. We've been told that the information is confidential. Now, of course, we find this to be quite challenging because government is the largest consumer of goods and services in the market. Now, if government is the largest consumer of goods and services in the market, and government has decided that, in fact, for those particular tenders that it issues, there's a minimum local content and the goods must be produced locally. Because it is trade policy and it is government policy, you would imagine then that if there's a decision to designate a particular sector, we should have access to the information, right? We should know who has applied for designation, what is the reasons for that, and what are the findings. When we see the findings, we want to see the report. That has not happened. That information has simply been deemed confidential. So that's why we say we don't know. This is what exactly we are sure of, that we do not know. But of course, there are things that we are not sure, we do not know, right? So we're using the language of Donald Rumsfeld, the former US Secretary of Defense. When you were speaking about the US Iraq war, when the United States went into Iraq on the pretext that there were weapons of mass destruction, and he made it clear that not only there were things that they didn't know, but there were also things that they didn't know, which were the so-called unknown unknown. For us, designation essentially fits that metaphor, right? That there are things that we do not know about designation in the PPPFA framework, and then there are things we do not know, And because we have no information, we have nothing to go on. Now, just to reiterate this point that I said at the beginning, we don't have a particular position about designation. I don't know if designation is good or bad policy. We have no idea. The reason why we have no idea is because we do not have any data that tells us why a sector was designated, what is the success and what is the failure, what were the targets of that designation. We don't know. What we simply know is that Treasury will issue a circular when a sector is designated. So if you go online and do search, all you'll find typically at the Treasury website and the DTIC website is that you get the circulars that simply tell the accounting officers, the relevant organs of state, that in fact, a particular sector has been designated for local production and content. It tells you the threshold. It will say you this particular product has been designated. It's a railway rolling stock. It's a power line. It's been designated at 100% local content. That's as far as it goes. You don't know who applied for the designation. You don't know when this decision was made. You don't know what investigation happened. You don't know who was consulted. So we are not saying designation is a good or bad policy. We have no stance on that. We simply don't know. And our emphasis on that is that process matters, right? When it comes to designation, process matters. When it comes to industrial policy, process matters, because we know that typically a bad process produces bad outcomes. Now, we went on and have been advocating for designation to be opened up. And through the process of us filing power requests and through the process of the Public Procurement Act, we fought hard for the process of designation to be opened up so that there can be a clear, procedurally fair process that is rational, that allows access, that also provides for an open investigative process. And because of that, in the Public Procurement Act, through our efforts, we'd like to believe, the Public Procurement Act then had a process, then has then, of course, adopted a designation provision that at least seeks to comply with the idea of procedural fairness. So we have said already, like I said in that timeline, that when designation was killed off in 2022 by the Constitutional Court, and then this was confirmed by National Treasury in the procurement regulations of 2022, the Public Procurement Act then revived the designation provision in Section 20. And of course, now we have designation as a government policy again. So what are the changes then that have happened in the Public Procurement Act that speak to the designation process? So if you read Section 20, it's clear. One, designation is no longer perpetual. So as it stands, we have 29 sectors that have been designated. We are actually unsure as to the status of these designations. Do they continue to exist or not? That is not clear to us because we know the Constitutional Court said you can no longer designate. Did that mean that you cannot come up with new designations? Or did that mean that, in fact, even the existing designations fall away? That is a question we have not gotten an answer for. But what we now know is that the designations that will be done under the Public Procurement Act have a set time frame. The minister will have to set a specific period to say the designation is set for this period of time. Secondly, there is procedural fairness in the sense that when there is a proposed designation, the Minister of Trade will publish the proposed designation in the DTIC website and in the Government Gazette. You will be given 30 days to comment on it. Absent, of course, in the statute is the idea that you could ask for an extension. I'd imagine that you should be able to be given an extension to be able to make substantive submissions. And that is where we come in, of course, in terms of helping you to make those submissions as XA. There's also clear criteria on designation. Now, if you go back to designation in the 2011 regulations, in the 2017 regulations, you would not find the criteria for designation. All the procurement regulations simply said was that the minister can designate. State organs can designate. Why, we do not know. This criteria now sits in the Procurement Act. For the first time, there's clear criteria, and I'll come back to that. Furthermore, there is a waiver mechanism that sits in the Public Procurement Act. Now, under the previous regime, the procurement instrument seemed to exist out of nowhere. We knew the DTIC would grant you a waiver in instances whereby the product could not be locally sourced. But that was not in the PPPFA, it was not in the regulations. In the Procurement Act, that waiver instrument sits there. And in fact, it is a robust mechanism that allows for waiver to be granted in instances whereby there is no local production of the relevant product that needs to be provided to government. There's also a monitoring and evaluation tool, which has never existed before. So the minister is required to conduct ongoing monitoring and evaluation of whether the designation actually is working and whether it's actually still needed. Tied to that is an interim review mechanism, which says at least after 12 months, the minister can actually review whether the designation is still required for that particular sector. So coming back to the issue of the criteria of designation, I'd say now that there's clear criteria, better than what we had in the previous regime. Firstly, designation will only be granted if there's actually local capacity, right? So is there sufficient local capacity to actually produce the relevant product? Secondly, will the designation have an impact on the security of supply of a particular product? Number three, there will be an assessment of what is the impact of the designation economically, what is the impact of designation on employment, and also what is the impact of designation on the imports. So now we have clear defined criteria, which we will be able to assist you in applying for a particular product to be designated. But I must add here that part of the challenge we have, of course, with designation is how does the designation application actually land before the minister? Because remember I said, what will happen with designation now is that previously we used to have designation being notified at the end through a circular. Now what will happen is that there will be a gazette published in the government gazette, of course, a proposed designation, and also on the DTIC website. But the problem that we have is, how does one get the application to sit before the minister's desk? How do you apply? Who does the investigation? What is the evidential standard for a proposed designation to go out? Do you need a case for a prima facie case? In other words, do you need a case that is sufficient for the market to actually respond to? What is the confidentiality regime? Because we know the previous regime, everything was confidential. What is the regime now? Will we have access to non-confidential applications? And how would people go about accessing the information in the designation investigation? So what then needs to happen? Because I have said that we only know about designation in the Public Procurement Act, but we have nothing about designation in the draft general public procurement regulations that have been recently published, of which there are comments that need to be made. So the first thing that needs to happen is that the Treasury needs to draft, or at least the DTIC in this respect, because the DTIC is the one that will make the decision. So the DTIC, in consultation with Treasury, need to come up with dedicated preferential procurement regulations that focus on the idea of designation, because the designation process as it sits in the Public Procurement Act is incomplete. We don't know the investigative process that is supposed to happen. What we know is that there's going to be a proposed designation, but we have no idea as to how do we get to the point whereby the designation sits before the minister. So that needs to be addressed. Secondly, we require that the DTIC must publish all designation investigation reports. So these reports need to be published so that we can know whether the relevant designations that have been made in the 29 sectors are actually working, and the rationale and the reasons for those particular designations. Number three, we would like ITAC to review all existing designations against current necessity, meaning should they exist or not. And the reason why we want ITAC to do this is because we trust the ITAC process. ITAC has 23 years of experience with trade policy. It has been conducting trade investigations in that period. It's got a dedicated investigative capacity and a commission that makes the final call. And we trust the ITAC process because it is built on constitutional principles of procedural fairness, reasonableness, lawfulness, and of course, a right to reasons. And of course, we believe that ITAC is best suited to conduct this investigation because we know that under the current Public Procurement Act, it's unclear who's actually going to conduct that investigation. And we believe that if there's preferential procurement regulations that deal with designation, in the ITAC must be appointed as the body that will address the issue of designation. We believe that, of course, the goals that are set for designation must comply with the SMART framework. Basically, we need specific targets, right? Targets that are measurable, that we will be able to measure designation against which. Because under the previous designations, we don't know what the goals were. We don't know if those goals have been achieved. But the current idea of designating a particular product, we would like specific and measurable targets to be arrived at. Another big problem we've always had with designation is the idea that sectors get designated. What we would like for designation to happen is that we should only designate products, and those products must be linked to our obligations under the World Trade Organization. What does that mean? It means that we need precise product designations that are tied to what is called the tariff code of a product, which comes out of the harmonized system of classification. Now, why is this important? If you designate a sector, it is very difficult to track whether the relevant participant in a particular tender has complied with the designation requirements, simply because if it's a sector, how then do you know what particular product falls within that particular sector? So what we believe is that without tying the designation to a particular product and the tariff code under the WTO regime, it opens itself up the process of designation to circumvention. And we believe that without tying a particular product to a tariff code, designation will not work effectively. Now, of course, like I said, ITAC is best suited to do this because ITAC deals with this, right? It deals with products. It knows how to define a product. It knows what a tariff code is. And we believe that the expertise sits with ITAC, and they should be the people that are the custodians of the process. So, like I said already, we are not sure of what is the current status of the designated 29 sectors. But what we do know is that there is a new investigative process that is supposed to happen. That process is incomplete as it sits in the Procurement Act. And we are advocating that, in fact, the relevant process that sits now in the draft General Public Procurement Regulations should be amended to include the process, or at the very least, at least we believe, there needs to be a procurement process in terms of designation that sits in a separate set of regulations. So we need preferential procurement regulations that address the investigative process of designation dedicated to designation on its own. So what are the urgent next steps that we believe you should take? Firstly, for you to be able to, obviously, to win in the race, you need to participate, right? So the first rule is that you need to respond to the proposed draft regulations, right? The preferential procurement regulations. Now, you must appoint XA. That's what we advocate for, obviously, right? So we want XA to be appointed to assist you with this response. The deadline is quite close, so it's the 15th of June. So you have to get in your submission as soon as possible, and we'll help you with that if you approach us. You must assess your business risk if the regulations are imposed as is. And finally, once implemented, XA can assist with getting products designated or reviewed. So we have, we believe, the most experience in the designation sector. We've been working on this, Donald and I, over the last, I'd say, 8 or 9 years. We've been working on the idea of designation, how it works. We've published papers on it, we've published research on this. So we have significant experience in the area. And we would like to help you, firstly, in making a submission on the draft regulations, but also would like to help you in, of course, getting your product designated. But that requires that we first, at the very least, make a submission in respect of the regulations. And also we advocate for a more clear investigative process in the preferential procurement regulations that should sit within the Public Procurement Act. So I've said quite a bit. I'm going to hand over to Donald to just summarize it a bit for us.
Yeah. Clive, thank you very much. We're going to bounce over to questions in a moment. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can either type it in the Q&A box or you can raise your hand. I think it doesn't at this point help to argue around whether designation is a good or bad idea. On a personal level, I don't like it, but it also is what it is right now. And so when the Act was initially came out for comment, Clive and I spent quite a lot of time working on what we'd like to see in the Act. And many of the safeguards you see now are the very safeguards we had proposed a couple of years ago, which I have to tell you landed as quite a shock because it looked like someone had actually read the submissions. This is going to be a fact of life. I don't think there's any way around that. Perhaps the legality of all of this gets challenged. That's not really the point of this conversation, other than to say this is very likely to happen quite soon, and it is important to be ready for it when it arrives. Now, importantly, designation is an issue that only affects government procurement. So designation has nothing to do with one local company supplying another local company. It has to involve government procurement. And so for most of that means involved with some sort of tendering process. I think important to note as well that when a sector is designated, it has a percentage of local content attached to it. it's a weird calculation. I mean, essentially, they just take
Don't know.
yeah, Clive.
Yeah, no.
It
But it's fine. I think maybe it was just me on my side. I think we'd lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
No, it's very clear, loud and clear.
Okay. So yeah, the local content is essentially the value of the service or goods minus whatever was imported, and the balance is the local content. The reality of how this works becomes very, very complicated. There's not always a huge amount of detail on these calculations. And we must also understand that there needs to be a mechanism for when the local content is either not available or it is available, but the local producers can produce 10 and the requirements are for 20. And so there has to be a mechanism to allow relief when the local content is not there. There's been some litigation around this. There was a case of the transformers a couple of years ago, where a domestic producer of transformers said a municipality purchased imported transformers. They were meant to buy local. They didn't buy local, and they wanted to be compensated for the losses that they incurred because of that. There's another issue on the go at the moment regarding solar panels. The domestic producer of solar panels says that on these big projects procured by government, they should be buying local. The importers say, well, but you don't produce enough of them and you don't produce the correct range. And so, of course, as all of this moves forward, we also begin adding more and more red tape to the process, which raises the cost and, of course, opens the door for all kinds of untoward behavior. So, at some point, somebody gets to claim a product is local because they sewed the buttons on in South Africa, that sort of thing. And so the very unsophisticated way this has been assessed is also potentially opens the door for some kind of grift to take place. All right, I see we have some questions coming in. Jacqueline, I think I've answered your question. Yes, I mean, this is essentially applying for tenders. If you supply government, whether it be an SOE, national government, a municipality, whatever it might be, this is going to become a factor. We should also recognize that government views this as an unbelievably important and valuable lever to pull. So my prediction on this is we are going to see a significant growth in the attempts to add more products. And we should not forget services can be put in here as well. More products and services into the fold. It's worth noting as well that when cement was designated, it didn't only include the contents of the cement. So, the cement must be made out of domestic raw materials, etc. But also it would apply if cement was supplied on any project funded by government. So even if government themselves were not the owner of the project, it wasn't a municipality paying for a bridge or something, but let's say the IDC was funding a commercial project, it would still require local cement. So it can become a lot broader than it would appear on the surface. Busisiwe asks, any thoughts on the pre-qualification criteria in Section 18A of the Act and Regulation 60 of the draft regulations vis-a-vis the proposed amended BEE codes? Clive, I'm not even going to try that. The minute I see section numbers and regulation numbers, I hand off to the lawyer.
No, I also won't touch it a lot. We are not experts on the general procurement framework. Our focus has always been on the preferential procurement, focusing on designation itself. So we don't touch on the general procurement framework. So we don't have any view on that, unfortunately.
Busisiwe, if you drop us an email at the end of this, I will connect you to somebody who absolutely can answer your question. But Clive and I are not really your ideal person. Taffy says, "Hi, Clive. Thanks for a good presentation. 2 questions. While I understand the fruit from the poison tree argument, we have always understood that what was deemed as unconstitutional from the 27 regs was the use of BEE status as a pre-qualifier and not designation explicitly. It seems that you were suggesting that designation was also explicitly deemed unconstitutional. Or alternatively, was it just not included in the new interim regs 2022? And if so, does that make it unconstitutional? At present, there are some state organs that indicate that they may observe designated status on some products, while the PP bill and regs is still being finalized. Would that mean that the state organs would be acting unconstitutionally? Are you not laboring ITAC with an obligation that is beyond its mandate, industrial policy versus trade policy? That's a mouthful. Off you go, Clive.
Wow, that's the easy part. So Taffy, the Constitutional Court was not called upon to decide on designation, so it was not an issue before the court. But the way the court interpreted it was such that if the pre-qualification criteria were outside the powers of the minister, they then saw that as tainting the rest of the registration, the rest of the regulations. So therefore, the court then ruled that the whole set of regulations were invalid and unconstitutional. So it wasn't that designation was explicitly an issue. It was never an issue before the court. Many other regulations were not an issue before the court. All that was problematic was this issue of pre-qualification criteria. And the court saw them as essentially at the heart of the set of the regulations. So by invalidating them, they then saw that the rest of the regulations would essentially be invalidated, including the designation provision. So by default then, as a consequence of the court's decision, the designation requirement was essentially deemed unconstitutional. Not because it was pleaded before the court, but because essentially the court saw them as a joint at the hip together with the pre-qualification criteria. Now, the 2022 regulations essentially got rid of designation. There's no mention of it at all. They said in the 2017 regulations, but suddenly in the 2022 regulations, we didn't see designation. Not quite sure what happened there, but there is no, at least by my reading, no requirement to designate a sector in the 2022 regulations. What that actually means legally is a bit of a challenge for me. But I think at least at first blush, because the designations essentially don't say what the time frame for them is, I think the designations seem to exist in law. Now, what the state organs, how they view them, I can't comment on that. But at least as I read it, they were not time bound, so they would seem to still be valid. And the thinking would be that, in fact, if the designation has been made, then the state organ should comply. If they choose not to comply, I'm not sure what the basis of that would be, so I can't comment on that. On the issue of ITAC, are we settling too much on ITAC? Well, ITAC obviously has self-evidently considered that they are struggling with capacity, that they don't have enough staff. So we accept that part. But ITAC by default does decide on trade policy, because when ITAC makes the decision that an anti-dumping duty must be imposed, or a safeguard duty must be imposed, or a tariff must be imposed, they are essentially not only dealing with industrial policy, but they're also having impact on trade policy, because the trade policy, as I understand it, is how we relate with countries outside of South Africa, with our trading partners. And when we impose a safeguard or when we impose an anti-dumping duty, we're essentially saying this is our trade policy in respect of that. So, and ITAC also does do investigations on behalf of the minister. So the minister does authorize ITAC to do investigations on his behalf on certain trade policies. So our thinking really is that ITAC might not have the capacity, we concede that, but we believe that ITAC has the expertise in terms of industrial and trade policy, because we don't think that there's anyone better suited to make that call than ITAC, because they are a specialist trade investigative body. The DTIC, we're not sure who would do the investigation there. We know that there was a person who dealt with designation. We don't know of any other person that was involved in designation. who've never been able to access the process. So our lack of confidence in the DTIC is not based on the fact that we think the DTIC cannot do the job. It's simply because we don't know. The DTIC has never given us an idea as to what goes on. All we ever receive is a circular that says a sector has been designated. So without the DTIC bringing us in and letting us know what the capacity is, what is the investigation, who does the investigation, what has actually occurred, we can only trust what we know. And what we know is that the ITAC process works. It's got its chinks, just like any other process. But at least we know in 23 years of time how ITAC operates, that it's got a clear administrative process that is based on the Constitution, and that there's a transparency that goes with ITAC over at least 2 decades of experience. When it comes to designation at the DTIC, we don't see that. And because we don't, we believe that ITAC is better suited to do that. And we believe that they will be the people that would do a better job of at least dealing with designation. At least we know the question is open because we're not sure who would do the investigation. So the minister could easily say, I'm directing ITAC to do the investigation. I think let me stop there for now.
I might just add something to that, which is we understand ITAC is stretched, Taffy. That is absolutely true. That's a problem they've got to sort by employing more people, and that's just how it needs to be dealt with. The other thing is, their budget should then be increased to accommodate this. Although ITAC certainly are busy, but I wouldn't want to underplay that. They are not sitting with the biggest workload they've sat with for, in their whole sort of time of existence. So I think ITAC could do this. The ITAC Act it creates a very good environment for this kind of process. It deals with all of the things that the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act requires. So it just kind of drops in really well. I think it's better than the alternative inside the DTIC. I'm not averse to the DTIC moving staff over to ITAC and increasing their budget to cover them and then let them get on with it. It would be a small jump. Another question from Anonymous. What is a realistic expectation of M&E and interim reviews of designated sectors under the Act by the DTIC and or Treasury or ITAC, as we suggested? Clive?
I'm not sure if you want to take this, Donald.
Well, let me take a swing at it. I think once the regulations come in, then the whole Act becomes truly active at that point. Like the Act exists on paper at the moment, but it can't really do anything. My personal view is that all of the current 29 sectors would immediately become open to review at that point. But whether that will happen is a different question. The current regulations don't talk about how such a review needs to happen. Does ITAC self-initiate? Can a company approach ITAC to say, hey, we'd like the wheelie bin designation to be re-looked at? That sort of detail is missing here. And this is part of the problem with these regulations. I mean, the regulations typically contain the way the Act will be implemented. This is a bizarre situation where the Act actually contains a lot more detail on designation. And Clive, I think it's fair to say the regulations are almost silent on designation.
Yeah, I think they make some cursory reference to the requirement of sufficient manufacturing capacity, but nothing. Because for us, the big issue is process. And we think process typically in our statutory framework would sit in the regulations, right? You'd have the Act telling you the principles. So as the Act does, it creates designation, it tells you the principles, tells you the criteria. The process of investigation would sit in the regulations. Then you'll be able to see where the problems are and be able to say, listen, tighten up the process here, tighten up the process there. But right now we have the anomalous situation whereby, in fact, the Act is better than the regulations in terms of process. And that's a huge gap. That's a problem because, like I said, maybe to reiterate this, the biggest challenge we have right now is we don't know how you go about putting the application before the minister's desk. We don't know what the application would look like. We don't have a template of the application. If you look at the ITAC process, we know how you get the application to sit with ITAC. We have a template of the application. With designation, we don't have that. So the pre-initiation process is a big problem. And we know that the pre-initiation process typically, together with the initiation, the investigation, and the review process, would normally sit in the regulations, as we have, for example, with the tariff regulations, dumping, safeguards, and countervailing. I'll stop there, Donald.
Yeah. Do we have any hands raised at all? If we do, we can take questions. We do not. And I think we have indeed. Now, Carlo, do you want to pop your question up? Hello?
Hi, am I unmuted? Am I audible?
You are. No, you are now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I am Nyakalo Dlambulu from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. I would have actually preferred that the speaker, when doing this presentation, would have consulted the DTIC to find out exactly what goes on when the designation processes unfold. If you are part of the industry, we do these designations with the industry involved. We work with the industry. There is no secrecy in how we do the designations. I would just like to say, perhaps do talk to the DTIC. The ITAC has got their own mandate and the DTIC has got their own mandate. Thank you.
I'd like to comment on that. Thank you very much, firstly, for pointing that out. This is not for lack of attempting to talk to the DTIC. We've been having conversations, rather fruitless conversations, for 4 to 5 years now. So it certainly has not been for lack of interest. And let me perhaps spell out the specific concerns. Now, Carlo, if you don't mind, offline from this, I'm going to contact you, and we'd like to have a very constructive conversation with you about what you've just mentioned. The issues we raise here are, firstly, that yes, consultation happens, but consultation is not driven from the outside in. Let me perhaps explain that. Normally, let's just use ITAC as an example. ITAC wants to remove a duty or increase a duty or whatever. What happens is they publish a gazette. The gazette comes out. Everyone has an opportunity to comment on it. In the case of designation, the DTIC decides who they talk to. I'd reference you back to what happened to the cement case, where some of the local producers were locked out of the process. They didn't even know they were being considered. The second concern we have is there are no reports published. We've requested reports providing the reasons for the decision. We've never been given access to those reports. In fact, we've been told consistently that they are confidential. We argue they cannot be confidential. And so we would like to see the 29 reports that follow the administrative decision to designate certain sectors. There isn't a transparent process to make an application to the DTIC. There isn't clarity, for example, on who makes the final decisions. So again, if we go to ITAC or we don't go to the Competition Commission, it's all spelled out very clearly. Our experience, and I'm very happy to be wrong on this, is that does not happen on designation. Or do you think my comment on that is unfair?
Thanks, Donald. It is unfair.
Okay, but then let's have a cup of coffee.
Yes, I think we should have a cup of coffee, and you'd appreciate that with the new PPA, we will be gazetting, and you will have the opportunity to actually interact and engage whatever designations that we've put forward.
Yes,
thank you.
But that was never there before, I guess is the observation. But we're very glad it is there now. So thank you. Taffy?
All right, cool. Thanks, Donald. Thanks, Clive. I just want to make 2 points. The first is just to take the opportunity to say that at least as an organization, and here, I mean, I've mentioned it earlier, for those who don't know, we represent CIFSA, and our position is that designation is obviously something that we are fully in support of. What needs to be fixed up is where there are flaws. That definitely needs to be fixed up. But it's an important point I just need to raise for the reason that it's actually been quite transformational. I mean, across our different industries that we represent, 5 come to mind: cables, transformers, some structural steel, valves and pumps as well. You see the impact of there not being designation when we moved interim regulations and then sectors were exposed. You almost saw it immediately. And by implication, I mean adverse implication. So that's just maybe a general point I wanted to make firstly. Secondly, though, is the fact that while I understand your ITAC issue, and I'm just going back to my question, and I appreciate both your responses on ITAC, I guess my concern was more the way you've answered it to say they are better placed because there's a degree of industrial policy, then where does it stop in terms of how much you throw under them? Because next we might be arguing that, okay, we need to revisit all master plans, and because they have a degree of industrial policy, ITAC should look at it. And anything else has a degree of industrial policy to it, and then you end up putting all that under ITAC. And that's why I was maybe making the point that is ITAC's mandate not best left at trade policy and everything to do with HS codes, rebates, tariffs, etc.? That it has an implication on industrialization is separate. But to then say that their work is primarily industrial policy led and they must sit with that, that's why I was worried about if you're not laboring them with something that is actually not within their mandate. That's just a take 2 on my ITAC question. Thank you, Donald. Thanks, Clive.
Taffy, I'm going to take the ITAC part of that question. And by the way, I mean, I'm happy for it not to be ITAC. I suspect ITAC at this point are sticking needles in a doll that looks like me right now, asking them to do this. But the value in ITAC doing this is, firstly, this should be HS code driven. It should not be done without an HS code. To talk to why that matters so much is you can put a policy in place. The only way you know if something is being imported is when it flows through a tariff code. So, you could then connect, and I'm no fan of more permits, but you can connect a permit to it. You can say, under these codes, you've got to get a permit. If this product is coming in for a government project, you need to have a particular permit. And then it becomes very easy to manage, and you don't even have the offensive product enter the country if it's going to be a problem. The second reason I propose ITAC is an investigating body. And the challenge you've got at the moment is the DTIC is not an investigating body. They have all sorts of other functions, but doing investigations is not their job. To do verifications, visiting the companies to see what is going on, etc. ITAC has that capacity in-house already. We have our differences with ITAC, but for the most part, I'm a huge fan of the process that ITAC follows. I think this could benefit from that process, but certainly I'm not married to it. That's not the most important part of it. We just thought it would immediately bring lots of very good disciplines to a process which, to date, Nyakalo's very kind offer to have a cup of coffee aside, I don't think has worked that well. But that's my comment on the ITAC side of things. I have a question before, and Paul, I'm going to come back to you. Someone has asked if I couldn't, however, pose the question Busisiwe had raised earlier to Nyakalo, or if you've got another colleague here from the DTIC. Nyakalo, let me just quickly read you the question again. Any thoughts on the pre-qualification criteria in section 18.1 of the Act and regulation 60 of the draft regulations vis-a-vis the proposed amended BEE codes? Do you want to take a swing at that? No? No takers there? Any other DTIC folk that would like to give that a shot? No, doesn't look like it. Nyakalo, I see your hand is up. Would you like to raise something else?
Sorry, Donald, that's a legacy hand. I am hoping my colleagues from industrial procurement are on this call. They are best suited to take that question. Thank you.
No problem. Paul, do you still want to add a comment? No? All right. Okay. Paul, I see your questions been answered. Okay, all good. Nyakala, I will be in touch with you to set up some time for Clive and I to come and see you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Bye.